Okay, so now we're going to begin a new topic, which is the Jacksonian period. And the way we're going to approach this topic is to look at both economic changes and political changes that happened during the Jacksonian period. These are both critical episodes in our country, economically and politically speaking. And what you have before you in the slide are the earliest factories that are going to emerge in the United States. Basically, before the Jacksonian period, were predominantly agrarian, right? The small family farm was really the basic unit of the economy. But then you're going to see, and it doesn't happen overnight, but eventually you'll see these farms disappear in the face of growing factories. Now, let's not forget that Hamilton had his famous report on manufacturers, which we discussed previously, and his vision is going to be realized. That is to say, the United States becoming commercial and industrial rather than predominantly agrarian, as Jefferson envisaged. And the other picture is, of course, President Andrew Jackson. As you know, he's on the $20 bill we have today. And he's going to be really the symbol of changes in our American democracy. And to cut right to the chase, here's the era where um, property ownership is no longer required to vote. Okay, so they eliminate property qualifications, which means that you could be poor. Of course, you still have to be male, but you could be poor and still have the right to vote in the United States. So this is a major achievement in the history of not just American democracy, but democracy in general in the world back then. But before we move to the Jacksonian period, we need to talk about this period called the Era of Good Feelings. It's sandwiched in between the end of the War of 1812, which, let me remind you, ends in 1815. And then the Era of Good Feelings ends in 1828, which is the beginning of the Jacksonian period. That's when Jackson is elected to office. Now, we previously mentioned during our discussion of the early national period that what you have happening is the loosening of connections, not only with England after the War of 1812, but also with Europe as a whole. And you see increasing nationalism, as we discuss. You had the war hawks who had this vision of the United States becoming eventually powerful, right? And you see, in other words, the expansion of the national economy. And this is a change in the Jeffersonian vision that we discussed when we talked about Jefferson's simplicity and the revolution of 1812, as you meant, or excuse me, 1800, revolution of 1800, um, where Jefferson really saw the new republic as more simple, right, and agrarian. Well, it's the opposite what happens. The new republic becomes complex. Okay, and we'll be charting this from this era of good feelings really till the end of the course here. That is with the Civil War. Okay, so you have this period again in between the early national period and the proceeding Jacksonian period, which begins in 1828. So, why is it called the era of good feelings? Well, this short period of 13 years, here's when you see the citizens of our country, not to mention the leaders, um, no longer feel uncertain or insecure about the survival of the republic. If you remember, that's why or the leaders back then, came out with a new constitution by 1789. It's because they felt the old government and the old republic was staring into the abyss of disaster. Well, the Constitution seemed to be working. Not only that, we had this war with England, and we didn't lose. We didn't win, but we didn't lose, which is a way of winning. But you see increased nationalism, right? So it's called the Year of Good Feelings, by the way, because a journalist, a newspaper writer, was keeping track of the president back then who was touring the republic, and he said everyone has good feelings. This is the era of good feelings, and for some reason, that name stuck. Okay, so the main thing we want to discuss with the era of good feelings is increasing nationalism. Let me remind you that nationalism, if you're talking about it in an economic sense, you're talking about it becoming self reliant, independent, no longer dependent upon other empires or countries, namely Great Britain or the English Empire, right? We become economically self sufficient. But you could also talk about nationalism in a sense of the nation in general, building and becoming more on secure foundations, and even feelings of patriotism. Right? Okay, so the whole argument here is that during the era of good feelings, you see increase in nationalism. Okay, so in order to answer that question, we could break it down to three aspects: the American system, a court case called the McCulloch versus Maryland, and a doctrine issued by President Monroe called the Monroe Doctrine in 1824. Okay, how do these three areas promote nationalism? Well, let's look at the first one, the American system. This is economic nationalism, all right, and it was devised by some senators. The main guy was John Calhoun, Calhoun, John Calhoun, who was a war hawk, if you recall. And the goal was to develop the republic in economic terms. And they felt for this to happen, you needed to have economic integration. Okay. And the ultimate goal, as stated here, once you integrate and you build the economy, you'll be self-sufficient. You won't be dependent or beholden in economic terms upon other nations. Okay, so this was the goal, and before the American system, well, we weren't really connected. You had all these states, but you didn't see infrastructure, really, namely roads, right, for commodities to flow in order to develop economically and commercially. Well, you need to connect the country, especially in an infrastructural sense, the building of roads and other means of transportation, canals, right? Eventually, railroads by the 1830s and 40s. So this was the goal, to achieve economic self-sufficiency, and it was called the American system. And by the way, when you think of American, you're thinking of nationalism, right? America, nationalism. So, again, in order to enable the flow of commodities and capital and labor and so forth, you needed to unite the country, especially infrastructurally. So, you see this project to increase the infrastructure. Let me move a little bit forward here, and this happens: the transportation revolution. Now, all these arteries you see spreading, which are you know um, basically roads and as mentioned here, turnpikes and so on. They didn't exist, let's say, in 1815. All right, and by the way, it cost more to ship something. By the way, we use that term "ship" even today when it's not being shipped on a ship, right? But back then everything moved faster if you shipped it on the seas. So because of lack of roads, it cost a lot more to ship something from the East Coast to let's say, Kentucky or Ohio than it did to ship something to England. All right, because of the lack of roads again. So what needed to be done, it was felt, was to develop it. All this arteries here and all these. This is called the transportation revolution, right? We see all these things like stagecoaches, turnpikes, the invention of the steamboat by Robert Fulton in the early 1800s, eventually the railroads, as I mentioned, the canal system, which is this. You may have heard of, the Erie Canal in upstate New York and other areas where, enabled a passage by boat and steam engines, right? You got to think steam engines as modern technology back then, right? They're using steam as a source of power rather than, the wind in the sails of the ship, right? So this is what happens with the American system. And it was very successful in consolidating the economy. And therefore, again, the attempt here was to, excuse me, was to, promote economic self-sufficiency. And that's indeed what happened here. Next is McCulloch versus Maryland. And this involves, again, what we call the elastic clause, right? The necessary and proper clause in the Constitution. We talked about that in a previous lecture. But let's remember how controversial that was. If you were Jefferson, you felt that the necessary and proper clause led to abuse of authority, overstepping the mandate of the government, right? Because you could make up any law, it seemed, as long as you justified it as, crucial to the accomplishment of an actual end or goal that's listed in the Constitution. So, however, in order to achieve economic self-sufficiency, it was felt that the necessary and proper clause was crucial, was vital. And of course, another name for the necessary and proper clause is implied powers, right? So also remember that during the creation of the first American bank, right, the National Bank, Washington, the president back then, and Hamilton appealed to the necessary and proper clause in the Constitution. So what happens here is this court case, McCulloch versus Maryland, leads to the Supreme Court saying that for all future cases, the necessary and proper clause, also known as implied powers, right, is going to trump that of what we called constructionism, which is the literal interpretation, right? Okay, so in other words, Hamilton wins the debate, right? From now on, implied powers has precedence over constructionism, that is literal interpretation. So, meaning that it might be not be literally stated in the Constitution that the government has this power, but as long as you can justify it, then it could be done, right? So, in the matter that I mentioned earlier, so here is eliminating an obstacle for economic nationalism. So hopefully you can see how that's tied to economic nationalism. You eliminate obstacles, political obstacles, legal obstacles that may be in your way in your pursuit of economic integration and economic self-sufficiency. Okay, another thing is the Monroe Doctrine of 1824 during the era of good feelings. And let's remember that what's happening in Europe is the age of empire. But during the 1820s, you see in the New World, or what used to be called the New World, right now, let's say Latin America, some colonies starting to revolt against their European masters. Okay. In fact, in the early 1800s, you see a full-on revolt in the country of Haiti. We call it today Haiti, right? They revolted against their French colonial masters, right? This was a slave revolt. But other flare-ups were happening. So, they were gesturing, the European imperial powers, that is, they were gesturing to form this coalition, come on over, and, not only display their strength, but even put down possible revolutionary flare-ups. So, well, we got wind of this, and we said to these Europeans, stay out of our side of the world, out of the Western Hemisphere. That's the Monroe Doctrine. Okay, it's saying if you actually come to our side of the world, which is the Americas, well, it could be construed as an act of war. Okay, and likewise, we won't go over there. So it was a bold statement at that time because America was just, as we know, building. We were, forming our country, our new republic, and we weren't in league yet with these powers, but we were taking a bold step here and saying, this is our side of the world, keep out.